Buenas and half a day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Independent Guåhan's General Assembly. So for today, what we're going to be going over is the 13 things you need to know about independence. And so it's just because it's our first General Assembly of the year, and it's been a while since we've had a refresher course for everyone. So my name is Francine Naputi, and my co-chair, Victoria-Lola Guerrero, will be joining me and going through each of these 13 points. Next slide. So with all of our General Assemblies, we like to start out with the Inifresi. So if you could just join me in saying that. Inifresi, ginani mastakulo, gihinasoku, I mastakalum gikorosonhu, zani masfigu, nani nasinyahu, uufrasen maisazo, parabaihu protehi, zanhu defendi, ihinengi, I cultura, I lenguaje, I airi, I hanum, zanitano Chamorro. Ni irenshoko diretu ginanazus tata, esti huafitma, gihilu I Biblia, zani bandirahu, I banderan Guåhan. So thank you for joining us tonight. And just for a few updates. So as I said, we're going to be talking about the 13 things you should know about independence, which will also be followed by a very short Q&A that each of you will get to chime in through our Facebook. Be sure to log in questions, and then of course we'll answer them as much as we can within the time that we have. And then next meeting, we're going to do our General Assembly on the very last Thursday of the month, so February 25th, 2021, starting at 5 p.m. Next slide. So Independent Guåhan, we really seek to ensure that we can empower the Chamorro people to reclaim our sovereignty as a nation, inspired by the strength of our ancestors and with love for future generations. We educate and unify all who call our island home to build a sustainable and prosperous independent future. So now I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Victoria-Lola Guerrero, and she'll start us off with the first point for tonight.
Half a day. Thank you so much for joining us in this new year and new experience. We're still online and we're glad that you're tuned in. And we're really excited to share these points with you today. One of the first things that we commonly hear about independence or surrounding independence is this idea that people feel very afraid of change, that, why change what people think is a good thing, right? So oftentimes, when we're talking about decolonization, people wonder why the status quo isn't a choice in our decolonization plebiscite, for example. A little side note, the three choices are independence, free association with the United States, and statehood. Status quo, which is being an unincorporated territory of the United States, is not an option because it is not a form of decolonization. It is a modern day colonial experience. Independence, however, is the natural way to be. In a majority of the decolonization votes that have occurred in history, independence was the predominant choice in these other nations. And this is because at the end of the day, the ability to make all of your own decisions and shape your own future is something that all people strive for. And in Guam, what we have now is not that. Currently, Congress has the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. So in its very basic definition, an unincorporated territory means that we are not part of, but belong to the United States. Next slide, please. What this means is that we have no control over a lot of aspects of our life that really matter. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we saw this particularly during the pandemic and times of crisis, but also in terms of things that really matter to us. All of the things that we experience today could change in a minute if Congress changed its mind about the kind of relationship it wanted with Guam. This is because as an unincorporated territory, we have no voting representation in Congress. We have a non-voting representative. We have no voting representation in the Electoral College, which selects the president. And we are under the full and complete legislative authority of Congress. We like to share this quote that new territories might never become states if Congress did not want them to be. What this means is that unincorporated territories particularly are not on the path to statehood. They were only intended to be property of the United States so that the US could essentially do whatever they wanted without the consent of the community. Next slide, please. That's very political reasons why status quo as an unincorporated territory is a lesser degree of governance, but on a very real social level, cultural level, status quo, there are lots of indicators that tell us that our quality of life as an unincorporated territory under status quo is also not very good right now. One of the things that we look to really try to understand the health and happiness of our community is our youth, right? How are we raising our youth? How are they feeling, right? What are they experiencing? And so every year, the Guam Department of Education has their students complete a nationwide youth risk behavior survey. And so I just have a little screenshot of some of the questions in this survey. And I wanted to just highlight a few, right? Our youth, 1,262 high school students had experienced sexual violence, 661 dating violence, 1,288 students felt sad or hopeless. That's 46.9% of students. So almost half of our teenagers are feeling sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row before taking this survey. 23.8% seriously considered attempting suicide, 24.4% made a plan to attempt suicide, and 16.5%, 1,073 teenagers actually attempted suicide. And this is really startling because, you know, what this says to me is that our kids are being forced to experience things like sexual violence or other forms of violence. There are other stats in this that reveal that they're already using alcohol, really serious drugs to numb out their experience. As a result, Guam's suicide rates are 50% higher than the United States. Our rape rate, our reported forcible rape rate, has been twice the national average for years. And also, our community has become very reliant upon, you know, programs like Medicaid or food assistance or housing assistance. And predominantly, our Chamorro people are the largest percentage of people who have become reliant on these programs. And a lot of these programs aren't creating incentives for people to be able to explore options or ways out of that reliance, really keeping us in this status quo situation. And lastly, every year, Chamorros make up the highest percentage of people living without homes. So, you know, there are other stats like the high rates of non-communicable diseases. Our top 4 leading causes of death are heart disease, stroke, cancer, and diabetes. Like, so these are all things that were not prevalent on the island before World War II and really have only become part of our experience in the last 70 years. And so when people say, why can't things just be the way they are? We like to encourage people to think and use our imagination about how can things be better. And we believe that independence allows us the fullest possibility of actualizing the things we hope for our community. Turn it over to Fran.
And so one thing with independence, and this is something that we've been asking questions about a lot of the time, is that independence allows us to define ourselves to ourselves and the world in ways that are more true to who we are and will protect us and our families. So this photo was taken right around the time that we were hearing about a lot of the nuclear threats that were coming from North Korea. And so many of us gathered around Chikapua Park to protest the fact that we were once again being threatened with nuclear weapons because of our really where we are in the American imagination, right? Oftentimes you'll hear Guam referred to as the tip of the spear. And it's really because of our proximity to the rest of Asia. So Guam is kind of in this beltway where Guam sits right between the West and then sort of the East, and then we are US soil. So a lot of the time, whenever they're looking at attacking the United States, Guam's usually the closest area. And so independence does not mean that we become instantly vulnerable to attack from another country. So really in response to the 2017 nuclear threat, I really wanted to point out this letter that Lola had written, and it was called An Open Letter from Guam to America. And the letter itself went around, like it garnered national attention. It was published in national newspapers. And in her letter, she wrote that to the American public, saying that, "I'm sorry that it is only when we are the subject of bombs that you can even attempt to say the word Guam. There are so many more interesting things I wish you would want to know about us. We, on the other hand, are not as surprised by the latest bomb threat. We are quite used to hearing Guam and bomb in the same sentence. Every month or so, when another missile is tested or rhetoric fired, we hear how North Korea or China or Russia could bomb Guam." Lola then ended the letter with, "I want to go to sleep peacefully, knowing that my family is safe in our home. So please stop all this bomb talk and instead ask yourself why Guam is still your colony in 2017. And really, with independence, something like this, in terms of our defense, is something we would be able to negotiate. We would be able to negotiate defense agreements with other sovereign countries, and we wouldn't necessarily be seen as US soil. So nuclear threats wouldn't actually be something that we'd have to necessarily worry about unless there is the presence of military bases in Guam. And even at that, as a sovereign nation, we could negotiate with the United States on more equal grounding as to whether or not we still feel that these bases should be in Guam, or to what extent these bases should exist in Guam. Next slide, please. So Lola's letter really illustrates the disconnect with America's public and their perception of the island. So for many of you who live in the States or who have gone to the States, you know that when you mention Guam, either people don't know where we are or they think of us as just this floating military base in the Pacific. And when responding to a lot of these threats, former President Donald Trump, he publicly announced North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal state. They will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. So he took a very aggressive stance towards that. When he heard that North Korea was planning this attack, he was telling North Korea that they would end up, really reacting to them. And we in Guam really had no say. We couldn't contact anybody in North Korea. We had no open line of communication with the President of the United States as to what it is we felt like we wanted. And one really prevalent thing about that was the conversation between President Donald Trump and the former governor of Guam, Eddie Calvo. So when Trump talked to Calvo, he was basically telling him, Guam shouldn't worry, everything's going to be okay. In fact, you should relish in this spotlight, because what that means is now you guys are known on a more global stage, right? You may even see an increase in tourism. And so the message was, don't worry about the bombs and instead think more about the visitors who are going to flock to the island because of the national attention that Guam was getting. And so what that tells us really is that the security of Guam's people is not necessarily a concern, at least in the American imagination. So next slide.
All right. Thank you, Fran. So our next point that we wanted, our next point that we wanted to bring up is that independence will allow us to redefine ourselves and explore other possibilities that align better with our values and help us care for our people better, particularly through our economy. So, oftentimes, we're made to believe that without the military, our entire economy will just crash. But the reality is that in the same way that our island is strategically located for defense, it can also be strategically located for trade. Even just, starting from our closest neighbors out to the larger region, connecting to the rest of the world. This is Guam's role, throughout history, as much as it has been, or even more so than it has been through the military. But even locally, again, as I mentioned before, a lot of our life changed after World War II and with the US's reoccupation of the island. Before the war, during the war, and even immediately after the war, we grew all the food that we needed. And in fact, we fed the military. And granted, things have changed to the degree that I don't imagine we would reach that level of food security. However, there are lots of really good efforts that are heading us in that direction. And there is much possibility in terms of exploring new ways and new methods of growing food. And Independent Guåhan has the potential to maximize our resources through significant investment in sustainable farming and fishing in an effort to achieve food sovereignty. Such a commitment serves to both grow our economy and lead our community away from dependency on economically impractical and unhealthy imported foods. So our reliance upon imported foods is directly connected to our higher rates of diseases, as I mentioned earlier, but as well, it has disconnected us from our land, which has always sustained us. And therefore, in our thinking about our land and its purpose, it's so easy for us to think that our only purpose is to serve the military. But in reality, our purpose is first and foremost to serve this land, the ancestors that have left it to us, and keep it safe and clean for future generations. And we can do that in a way that will actually grow our economy and our own independence in terms of how we get our food and how we feed ourselves. Next slide, please. A significant economic benefit would also be the termination of the applicability of the Jones Act, which makes the cost of food and other goods that come in and out of our island very expensive currently. As an independent nation, we actually are situated in the world's richest region. A lot of the economic prosperity of the region is shut off to us because of the US's defense interests. But as an independent nation, we would be able to negotiate trade. We would have full control of both our port and our airport. Now we don't collect fees. We don't collect, we aren't even able to do really important things like our neighbors in Palau were able to do with the Palau Pledge, where every visitor is charged, and that money goes towards protecting their environment because of the, inevitable degradation that can come from large numbers of visitors. They charge a fee to ensure that it doesn't damage the environment, and that they're able to protect their environment. For example, controlling who comes in and out of our island will also allow us to explore new types of tourism that are less harmful to the environment and welcome new types of tourists from other parts of the world that are currently shut off to us. We'd also be able to explore new industries. A lot has been, talked about the telecommunication industry and all the wires that run through Guam that we don't benefit from now. There are many things that other islands, other countries around us have also explored that we would be able to learn from. And as we develop our economy, we'll also be able to strengthen our ability to provide our own economic aid to our community in ways that will empower them and not set them back. Next slide, I'll turn it over to Fran.
So as a fourth point, independence does not mean isolation. Many times when we hear about independence for Guam, we think of Guam as an island. Therefore, we think of it as incredibly disconnected from the rest of the world. However, Guam is actually situated in one of the richest regions in the world. So we're right next to Asia. We're in the middle of the Pacific. We're not too far from some of the developed countries in the West. And so as a result, being less isolated, Guam will be able to speak for itself on a more global and international stage. So as I mentioned earlier, right now, Guam's perception in the international arena is that we're basically this floating military base for the United States. And so as a result, it makes it very hard for countries who don't have these established relationships with the US or like established visa programs with the United States to find their way into Guam because we're technically American soil. So like Lola was saying, the Jones Act really makes it difficult to get goods into the island because we have to adhere to the provisions of the Jones Act. Whereas if you think of it, a lot of the time, Guam is actually the first port on the way to the continental United States. And so we eat up a lot of the cost of these goods before they make it into the rest of the US. And so the elimination of the Jones Act will not only make goods cheaper, but it'll actually expand our trade routes. So Guam has a great strategic location in terms of trade. We're right near Japan, we're right near Australia. And so as a result, we could create a lot of those pathways as well. In addition to no longer being isolated, we'll have more of a voice on an international stage. So what that means is that as an independent nation, Guam can seek membership into organizations that we're not necessarily allowed into because we're not seen as a sovereign nation. So for example, within the United Nations, there are many programs that we can actually find funding within, but because we're under the United States, which is seen as one of the richest countries in the world and actually is known for giving the most in terms of foreign aid, Guam does not get any money because the United States is the one who negotiates all this foreign aid for us. And so just like any of the 50 states, none of the 50 states get money from any sort of organization. All that is done through the United States federal government. So what happens then is that each of these states and each of the United States territories then have to work with the American federal government to get any sort of funding or to even get supplemental funding for programs we may want to run. Currently, if you look at a lot of Government of Guam's budgets, a lot of our agencies, they're doing quite well in terms of operation. They're able to work within the budgets given to them through legislative appropriations or through the Office of the Governor of Guam. They're able to run their operations without having to squeeze too much out of their budgets. However, if you want to do something special, like if you're thinking about, let's say, for example, Guam Department of Education, like if they wanted to do a really progressive program in terms of technology or bring in a new industry to teach students, they would have to look for outside funding sources in order to do that. And they would usually have to negotiate that through the federal government. As an independent nation, we could reach out to nonprofit organizations, we could reach out to global international organizations to do initiatives like that, and we can seek out that funding on our own. So I'll turn it over now to Lola.
Eva, number 5, independence allows us to come together with a shared goal to shape a new Guam citizenship and negotiate unique relationships with other countries. So building on what Fran was talking about, oftentimes people say, well, oh, are you willing to just give away your US passport, or nobody on Guam will want independence because they can't be US citizens. So we hear this rhetoric a lot. And in fact, there is a lot of possibility for an independent Guam to still have dual citizenship with the United States if that's something our people want. And as an independent nation, we would be able to negotiate for in ways that we're not able to negotiate now. So the kind of citizenship that we currently have from the United States was not determined with us in the room. And that's why it's often described as a lesser degree of citizenship, one that doesn't give us full representation or the ability to elect all of our leaders, for example. However, other places like the Philippines have been, Filipinos have been given dual citizenship with the United States. Even Israel has a dual citizenship option with the United States. And not to say that we would emulate any other, behaviors or actions of these countries. I'm just saying that the possibility has already been proven that you can be an independent nation and still have unique citizenship arrangements with other countries. But eventually, and very excitingly, we would be able to develop our own citizenship, our own passports, our own, visas that will allow us to travel to parts of the world that currently a US passport wouldn't get us access to. So, I really wanted to showcase this image where you can see over 2,000 people marched, in support of Chamorro self-determination, but the crowd was very diverse. And I believe that the 2,000 people in this crowd holding this massive Guam flag all want to be part of a Guam that gives us more rights and a more desirable form of citizenship that doesn't deny us our rights. And so we believe that independence will allow that for us. I'll pass it to Fran. Next slide.
So for the sixth point, independence will allow us to share a more equitable relationship with the military on our terms, preventing the destruction that is taking place without our consent. So as we know, 27% of the island is currently occupied by the US military. And because of agreements made, that footprint is just getting larger and larger. So we have a reputation within the international community, and I mentioned this several times. Guam is known as the tip of the spear. We're known as Fortress Pacific. We're known as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And so as a result, that's why we keep getting a lot of these defense threats from neighboring China and North Korea, and even Russia, simply because of our relationship with the United States. But it's not just because of that, but it's also because of the presence of military weaponry and equipment in the island. So as noted here, we already know based in Guam, there are the B-1s, the B-2s, the B-52s, the THAAD defense system, nuclear submarines, and the Naval Ordnance Annex. So something quite interesting about the Ordnance Annex, which was formerly known as Naval Magazine Guam, is that it's actually located in the southern half of the island and is known to be one of the largest munitions areas on US soil, but actually outside of the continental United States. The area alone began, construction for the Ordnance Annex began in 1944, so post-World War II. And the Korean War further reinforced the need for such a storage facility to exist in Guam. In 1954, a total of 18,513 tons of ammunition was stored just within the Ordnance Annex alone. And so the island is known internationally for our role as a US military base. And it's not just Guam, there are even areas of the Marianas that are known for their participation. Tinian is another site that's quite famous for being the launching point for the nuclear bombs that made their way into Japan and became one of the few nuclear explosions that happened to a human population. And so even just past this whole historical point, Guam also is known for hosting very large US military exercises. It's known as Valiant Shield, Cope North, and Malabar. So militaries from all over the world actually send their soldiers and their sailors into Guam to train with the US military here. And that is why often, if you're walking up or down Tumon, and of course this is pre-COVID, and we're going to see this maybe once the island starts to reopen, but you'll see many military members who actually come from the standing armies of Japan, Korea, and Australia, just walking up and down through Tumon because they're participating in these exercises. Perhaps the largest and most commonly held military exercise held in Guam is Valiant Shield. There have been 7 Valiant Shield exercises that have occurred since 2006. And of the first of these exercises, it was held in Guåhan and the surrounding waters around our islands, and it featured more than 20,000 sailors, soldiers, Marines, and airmen. And as I said, additionally, the footprint only continues to grow. So despite legislative resolutions that have asked for a pause in military construction, we're still seeing land being cleared for military activity. And this land was cleared for the upcoming buildup. So this picture was actually taken last January. And so a lot of it has changed, and we're seeing that more and more land is being cleared. Next slide, please. So in this photo, many of you may be very familiar with it. It's actually Magwat, which was an ancestral village. So many of you will recall how Magwat kept getting put into the news because we were talking about the land clearing, and there were photos of ancestral remains being removed from the graves and pretty much carried out in brown paper bags. And that caused quite an uproar, because that's not how we want our ancestral remains to be treated, right? We would rather prefer that they just be left where they are and let them, rest there without being disturbed simply because of construction. So their bones were disturbed and dug up as a way to make way for the building of Camp Blas Marine Base. And in July 2020, Senators Sabina Perez and Therese Terlahi actually chaired a joint informational hearing about the clearing of these areas. And so both senators had stressed that historical places should just be left as they are, and we should be able to preserve them in place without disturbing anything. During the hearing, Shippo Patrick Lujan shared that he told them being the military, to remove their parking lot and respect that one burial that we found. But with this particular one, I know that we're not going to remove it. And I know that we're going to enforce the preservation in place and put together a nice reburial monument. And so these are mitigation tactics that have been used because the US military wants to continue having a presence on our ancestral burial sites. So they decided that since they're still going to end up bulldozing the site and building onto it, what they'll do is they'll remove the ancestral remains and they'll just rebury them elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened. So even with the uncertainty coming from the Guam public, in which we've made very public stances against such actions, unfortunately, the construction is still ongoing and it's still moving as planned. So on to you, Lola. Thank you. Next slide.
So also just like wanting to plug on that tip, Pratehi, Litexan, and a bunch of other local organizations are planning a protest next Saturday, February 6th at the ITC intersection in Adelup. So please visit. There's flyers being shared on Independent Guåhan, Pratehi Litexan's pages, and hopefully if you can, please come and support this effort. Okay, so usually when we do bring this up, the relationship that Guam has with the military and are rightfully critical of it, there are a lot of people in our community who are members of the U.S. Armed Forces or members of Guam's National Guard, and whose livelihood really depend on, their jobs and their retirement benefits and things like that from the United States. And often their questions to us are, well, what will happen to us? Will we still be able to get our retirement? Will we still be able to collect our Social Security? And we had a really amazing presentation several months ago from two veterans who read through all the documents and gave examples, many examples, particularly with the former Filipino soldiers who served the U.S. military, that even if you are not a U.S. citizen, if you served the U.S. military and you earn those benefits, they don't disappear. But also, I think more largely, one of the biggest questions people ask almost always when we do these presentations, it's one of the first things like, so you're just going to kick the U.S. out? They're not going to leave. They they've invested too much in Guam. And oftentimes, first and foremost, it requires a new framework, a new way of thinking about it, right? That first of all, it isn't just they give and give and give, right? And we don't give anything in return, because as Fran just shared, right now we've given 27% of our best of our island and some of our best lands for this military to occupy without choice. These are things that have been taken away from us, and that we haven't even begun to explore what we could have done if we had the choice of how to use those lands. But the reality is that because we are the longest colonized place in the world, colonization has created a dependency to a degree that it would be unjust for the United States to just up and leave the island without a transition period. And this was accounted for by the United Nations, and in the UN Charter, there is an obligation that former administering powers must assist in the transition of a former colony to independence. And so there are many models in the world of people that had, maybe a few months to, up to 30 years of a transitionary period, right? Even the Philippines themselves had a Commonwealth period before achieving independence from the United States. The rest of our region is independent with a transitionary period that we know as free association. And so this is from a study that economist Joe Bradley had done in 2000. He says, as a part of negotiated provisions for Guam's transition to independence, it is anticipated that the island will receive a substantial economic development funding over a period of 15 or more years, partly in exchange for U.S. military access rights in Guam. And I think that last portion is very significant. Right now, we did not give our sovereignty away. We did not say we are okay with this, right? It was taken from us. Those lands were taken from us. As an independent nation, they would need to request access to those lands, and we would need to negotiate how they can use them. We would be eligible to negotiate what's called a SOFA, or a Status of Forces Agreement, which independent nations all over the world have with the United States when they host U.S. military bases. That alone opens economic possibilities that we are shut out from today, to their advantage and our extreme disadvantage. Other aspects of our life, as I mentioned, control of our airport, control of, different types of programs that the U.S. federal government currently controls would have to be transitioned over to us. And so, we are not saying that independence would happen in a split second and be successful. We're very aware that due to our current circumstances, a transition period that is carefully thought out, negotiated, and ensures that we are able to smoothly become independent over time is what will happen for our island. So we wanted to clear that up for everybody. Of course, our ultimate goal is that we will shape a better future for our people. But in order to get there, we really do have to cooperate and negotiate and reach a better place that doesn't continue to sacrifice who we are and these lands that we've inherited. Next slide, please. So we're right about midway through our 13 points, and we want to hear from you. What does a successful independent Guåhan look like to you? If you could leave comments, just imagining some of the things we've shared, but also what are some of your visions? The next points are some of what we hope to be, visions that could actualize through independence. So please leave comments, please leave questions, and we'll be sure to read and address them after our presentation. I'll turn it over.
So another large question that comes up a lot of the time, and for many of you who are more familiar with Guam's constitutional conventions, we often get asked, do we need to write a constitution? So for point 8, independence will actually bring us sovereignty and the ability to design our own constitution. However, before we choose political status, we've noticed that maybe having a constitution in place prior to a vote would actually be a little more problematic than we would have originally thought, right? So what's really the point of a constitution? So a constitution really is, at kind of its bare minimum, it's a document where we decide who makes the decisions about the island and how are these processes outlined, right? So how is it that we make decisions, who gets to make the decisions, and it's kind of this guiding document going forward about how decisions and laws and policies are made. So if we create a constitution as a colony, then it's not truly ours because it has to be approved by the US Congress. And historically, Congress, what they tend to do is they'll take out many of the pieces that actually allows colonies to establish true sovereignty. And so this was actually illustrated with Guam's very first constitutional convention. So in the very first constitutional convention, the 10th Guam legislature went about funding this. And so they met between June 1969 through June 1970, and they had 43 elected delegates come together to really just discuss with each other what a constitution for Guam would look like, what kind of governance would we want. Just really, it was a futures exercise, right? This sort of nation building exercise. What would a country of Guam look like? And so what they did is they didn't actually have any federal authority to convene. So there was no obligation by the United States federal government to acknowledge really anything that the delegation put forth. So at the end of the year, they actually recommended 34 changes to the Organic Act of Guam, upon which the US Congress only agreed that one of the 34 would actually pass. So it's quite unfortunate. And it's very much like I said, a lot of the time, if US Congress gets the final say in what will go into a constitution, chances are they're going to strip away things that really give true sovereignty to a place. So even with the first constitutional convention, although only minor changes were made, the people of Guam kept pushing. They wanted to continue this path to get a constitution outlined for the island, but they decided that because of what happened with the first convention, they really wanted to address the idea of Guam's relationship with the United States in the second constitutional convention. So this constitutional convention, actually, in my opinion, was fairly progressive by today's standards. Though some of the measures were defeated, the delegates were considering passing individual rights that were only legalized fairly recently. So for example, within the second constitutional convention, rights such as the legalization of same-sex marriage and the equal protection of individuals whose parents were married or unmarried were actually included in what would have been Guam's constitution. So there were 34 delegates in this constitutional convention. They met together and they actually signed the Guam Constitution on December 15th, 1977 in Hagåtña. So once the document was signed, Governor Ricky Berdalio and convention president at the time, former Governor Carl T.C. Gutierrez, they took the Guam Constitution and presented it to US President Jimmy Carter. So Carter actually approved the Constitution, as did the US Congress. They were like, okay, we're satisfied with this document and we're gonna move forward. However, once they came back to Guam, the Guam public sort of took pause. They were like, hold on a minute. We have this constitution. However, we still haven't really addressed our political status. So the people of Guam rejected the constitution. 82% of the vote in a referendum that was held in August of 1979 decided that the constitution was not to go through. And the whole reason they said that was because, number one, this constitution was actually not a local expression of self-determination. And that was largely because the political status question was still unresolved. And so they felt that having a governing document actually didn't really mean very much if Guam was still considered a territory and a colony of the United States. And so groups really feared that passing such a constitution would actually impede on Guam's self-determination rights, because then the United States could turn around and say, oh, you guys already have a governing document that you decided upon, that you guys came together and created. So you've actually already exercised self-determination, and we no longer have any formal obligation to help you do that. And this actually runs counter to what the United Nations really outlined when they created Resolution 1514, which says that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So even with the Constitution, we still did not vote. And like Lola said, there are three choices in the vote. There's statehood, there's free association, and there's independence. So even with the Constitution of Guam, we still had no political status. So it actually wouldn't have been a true expression of self-determination. Next slide. And on to Lola.
All right. So our next point, number 9, is that independence will allow us the creativity to design a political system that learns from the mistakes of the past and from others in the world so that we can better protect our resources and care for our people. And so this is really in response to this idea that first we want to define ourselves by selecting which political status option we believe is best for us. And then we would go through a community-wide process to shape the Constitution. And that Constitution would create a political system that's more aligned with our actual experiences, our history, our values, and our unique community needs. So right now, a lot of what we have is just a kind of lesser degree of the US Constitution. And we wouldn't even need to mimic the US Constitution. We would have the absolute ability to create whatever we wanted. And, you know, in many ways, the fact that so much of the world has decolonized and that there are so many models of different types of government, we would have a lot of options to learn from and choose from. Our ancestors had village councils where, you know, everybody had voice, where there was consensus, where men and women were equal. You know, we wouldn't have, you know, sort of, we could even imagine that there always is a female and a male leader. And, you know, we could look to parliamentary instead of presidential government systems that will allow us to really be focused on the issues that matter as opposed to just political parties or individual candidates, which is a very sort of American individualistic approach to governing. I love this quote that's on the screen from Senator and Speaker Ben Pangilinan, who we miss so much for his wisdom. He says, "We once mastered the navigation of the seas. Surely we can determine our political future. We survived a world at war. Surely we can build an economy which leaves no hardworking families behind. We are the inheritors of an ancient land. Surely we can leave this place better than when we found it." What Senator Pangilinan reminds us is that we actually do have all the knowledge and expertise of our own place and our own people to know what is best for us. A lot of what colonization has done for us it has made us doubt who we are and what we know and what we're capable of. And it's limited our ability to excel to the highest levels that we have already proven we can excel at. We have survived so much, and we were sovereign for over 3,000 years, for much more of our experience here in this homeland, and we can be again. We just have to believe in ourselves. Oftentimes people's first reaction, gut reaction about why they don't support independence is they'll say to me, "Look at the government of Guam. It's so corrupt. You know, I don't trust the government. I don't trust any of the people in the government." And that kind of mentality, it doesn't help us grow, right? Because the government can always change. We can always make it better. We can write a constitution that writes out corruption, that has mechanisms to do that. We often forget that the government of Guam is a very young government. We only elected our governors since 1970. And we're doing so according to an organic act that was designed to give the federal government and the executive branch a lot of power to be able to control the island from Washington. And so we're governing with an antiquated document that wasn't designed by our people. Of course, corruption is going to exist. And not to say that it doesn't exist in all kinds of government structures, but we would want to learn from that. We would want to shape something better. And if we mess up, we get to try again, and it's on our terms, and because we will be free. And that's the important thing to consider. Next slide, please. Sovereignty as the right to self-determination also includes the right to nature. One of the things we have been disconnected from as a colony of the United States is our own natural environment. And we don't have the ability, as Fran shared earlier, to protect critical habitat, to protect important cultural sites. And oftentimes, even when we try to enforce stricter local laws to protect our environment, they can be overturned by Congress, the Navy, US EPA, and other federal agencies. We saw this in the clearing of all the lemai and ephit trees that occurred for the building of the Marine base. Everywhere else on Guam, you are not allowed to destroy these trees, and yet the military was allowed to destroy hundreds of them, trees that took hundreds of years to grow, trees that could feed us, and we could do nothing about it. We've had community uproar about the ancestral and cultural sites that are being desecrated for the building of this base. And no matter what, no matter how many resolutions we've passed, no matter how many letters our governor and our leaders write, the construction continues. That is not right. With sovereignty, we would determine laws about natural resources, plant and animal life, our lands, our waters, and we would be able to protect them. We have to remember that water is our most precious resource, that we need it to live. And currently, the continued construction of military bases on our island threatens the cleanliness and safety of our water, because the construction is occurring over our largest water source, the Northern Guam Lens Aquifer. And so in shaping a new government as an independent nation, we would be able to protect these things so that we are leaving a better place for the future to inherit. Like this Mangi Neni who says, I am Estigwizut para Chamorro self-determination. I am here for Chamorro self-determination. I'll turn it over to Fran.
So this next point is something very recent, and I know it's been on a lot of our minds. So for point 10, what we want to talk about is independence would have allowed Guam a greater ability to protect our people during the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of these headlines here, you're seeing that people were breaking protocol. We were even finding that people were leaving the hotel sites even though they were supposed to be under quarantine. The aircraft carrier was docked here in Guam, even though they were fairly close to other nations within the Philippine Sea. But because we're US soil, they traveled a bit of a way away from some of these more sovereign nations to come to Guam because we're an unincorporated territory of the United States. And it would have been easier for any American ships to dock themselves here. However, one thing that was very prevalent in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was that there was a lot of miscommunication and even just information not getting out to the governor of our island coming straight from the Joint Region Marianas. So a lot of the time, the governor really had to ask the military how many cases were they finding that were positive, how many cases were on this ship, things like that. It was just such a struggle to get information, especially in the early days of the pandemic, when Guam could have been a lot more proactive in terms of setting up plans to ensure that we didn't have community spread. And then also in the back, the headline off to the right, you'll see it says the coronavirus-free island nation of Palau could soon vaccinate almost all of its people. So Guam, we're fairly unique in the Pacific in that we have very high rates of COVID-19 positive cases, whereas the rest of the Pacific pretty much has seen very low rates of community spread. I especially want to point out the Northern Mariana Islands because their pandemic response was very different from Guam's. If you remember in the early days of the pandemic, we often heard about NMI receiving COVID-19 vaccine or testing kits from neighboring countries and having one of the most successful vaccination programs even to date. Even with their lower rates of COVID-19, NMI is still promoting a very aggressive campaign to vaccinate its residents. Earlier this month, Guam PDN reported that as of this past weekend, the CNMI had used about half of the vaccine doses it received in December, using them to vaccinate the equivalent of 5,322 people per 100,000 population. That's the best community vaccination rate nationally in comparison to any of the US states or territories. South Dakota was following the CNMI as the second most successful vaccination program, having only 3,042 people per 100,000 population. So they were still a lot lower than the CNMI, but the CNMI was able to do this because they have a very different agreement in terms of their relationship with the United States versus Guam because we are an unincorporated territory of the US. Next slide, please. So a lot of you may be tracking a lot of the COVID stats. So the top 5 countries in the world in terms of COVID transmission has been the United States, India, Brazil, Russia, and the United Kingdom. We're even seeing new strands, the UK strand, as many of you may have heard on the news, coming now into the United States and being found in, I think, more than 20 states throughout the US. And so those of us in Guam especially, we're scared that in the event this strain starts coming to Guam, what are we going to do? And a lot of the reason why that's very scary is because as a territory, we're not really allowed to close our borders in much of the way that the rest of the independent Pacific has been able to do. So very early on, places like Tonga, they were already closing off their borders. Places in Asia still have closed off borders where they're only allowing permanent residents in on a very case-by-case basis, and only fairly recently. The Federated States of Micronesia just had one of their first cases of COVID-19, and that was just in the last 2 weeks, whereas for a lot of us, COVID-19 has been going on for the last 10 months. On the table on the right, you'll see that places that are territories or have a very different relationship with the United States, instead of just being strictly a state, you'll see that our numbers in comparison to the US Virgin Islands, the Northern Marianas, and American Samoa are fairly high. So even when comparing the US Virgin Islands, if you do the calculations, only about 2.2% of their population have had COVID-19, compared to Guam, where it's about 4.7% of our population. And the largest difference between Guam and any of these island entities is that not only are we heavily militarized, but we have a different political status relationship with the United States. So with the exception of Guam, Micronesia has largely been able to keep COVID-19 out, and Guam has just really been having to be very proactive about it. And thankfully now we have a vaccination program going. And so hopefully we're starting to see that our numbers have been going down in the last recent weeks. Thank you. Next slide.
So I think one of the things that has been really evident to me through the COVID pandemic has really been the ways in which our values as a community don't exactly mirror the values of the United States. And so we really believe that number 11, the 11th point we want to make is that independence will allow us to make decisions rooted in our values first. And I say this because I think a lot of, while our numbers, I believe, are very high for this, the size of our community, I do think that a lot of us you know, who did stay home, who did wear our masks, who didn't question those orders from our governor, did so because of our deep value and respect for our elders and for each other. This idea that we are also connected, especially in a place Guam's size, meant that we understood the ways in which our actions affect others. Whereas in the United States to this day, there are still people who feel wearing a mask infringes on their freedom and are very adamant about not doing so, including a lot of the US's leaders. And so, you know, I think that that was really startling for me, and it's a really strong reminder, I hope, to our community that when we are able to make decisions rooted in our values, we will better be able to protect ourselves like the rest of our region was able to during a crisis like COVID. I love this photo because I think these future generation leaders are reminding us of our values: to be strong, to be good, to respect our island and our people, and really to love, right? To celebrate who we are and to love each other. And, you know, next slide, please. When we did this, we were able to live happier and healthier lives. The Chamorro people have lived in the Mariana Islands for over 4,000 years. Prior to contact with Europeans, they maintained healthy diets and lifestyles and revered their healers, who were called Makana and Kakana. The Makana and Kakana were believed to possess the power of causing and curing illness by invoking the Aniti, or spirits of the ancestors. This quote from Trisha Lizama and this image of a contemporary Makana or Zoamti with Amwe is a reminder to us again that our land and our knowledge of this land is really where we need to turn for answers in all times. And that, you know, oftentimes it's really difficult for us to imagine something different because, you know, this is all we've been taught, right, through various channels, that, you know, Guam without the US or without the military is just going to fall apart. I'm already seeing a lot of the questions coming in, particularly valid questions about Guam's safety and security if we were to be independent. But I want to challenge that and say, what about our genuine security? The United States military presence here has always put us at greater risk. It is what led to the attack on our island during World War II, and the suffering that our people experienced during World War II was not because the Japanese were attacking the Chamorro people, but rather they were attacking a US military base. The world sees us currently as a base of the US military. If the US military were to leave or change their relationship with Guam, if we were to become independent, we could maintain US bases, but they could be smaller. We don't need 30% of our island for military purposes. Other places in the United States don't have that. It's unnecessary. And it actually indicates that the US military's presence here is actually offensive. It's here to remind the region of its might, but not to protect us here. All that does is protect the continental US. It means that we would be attacked before the continental US would, which makes it more dangerous. Other places in our region have decolonized and not been attacked by other nations immediately. And in fact, the world and the United Nations has done a lot to ensure that if you do decolonize, the international community supports you so that no one just instantly takes you over. And I think that we have to remember that, again, when we root our future in our values, our ancestors believed that when one or two people died in war, you stop fighting, right? We didn't see ourselves as a warring people. And yet now our identity in the world is to be a base, to be a place for training for war, for housing war weapons. That doesn't serve the people of Guam. That serves the continental US. All we would need would be a smaller military force that protects our borders, and relationships with larger military bases or larger militaries for times of war. And we could shape that with every time we hear about Guam soldiers, we're told how they're some of the best in the world. Well, imagine if they were really fighting for Guam and for the freedoms that we continue to be denied. We'd be more than equipped to protect ourselves without having to be a place that is only known for war. And so I think that that's rooted in our values, and so many other things are. And it's really just a return to who we are, and independence allows us to do that. I'll turn it over to Fran.
So as Lola was saying, I think really reshaping Guam's identity on a more international scale, what independence will also allow us to do is it will allow us to really rejoin our region in a way we haven't been able to do simply because of our status as an unincorporated territory. So Guam right now, a lot of the time, the way we've had to kind of function foreign policy and even international relationships has really been to cater to the United States because we fall under the umbrella of the United States. And so what we mean by region really is we mean Micronesia, we mean the Pacific, and we mean the greater Oceania. So there are entities out there very much that are regional and really come together with all of the sovereign nations in their region to create these collective groups that will allow for a more successful and prosperous region. So one of them is the Melanesian Spearhead group. So this collective is basically 5 member nations. So it's Fiji, New Caledonia or Kanaki, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu. And so really what they did is they decided to really come together so they could strive for decolonization and freedom within Melanesia for their countries and their territories, who were still under colonial rule in the South Pacific. So by developing a stronger cultural, political, social, and economic trade identity, it really started to link them together and to also make each of the individual member states stronger on their own as well. So what they do is they have this sort of agreed principle of cooperation. And so what is entailed in that is that number one, independence is an unalienable right of colonial countries and peoples, and other shared principles such as economic and technical cooperation between each of these states. So what that means is that they tend to have trade agreements with each other so that they can decrease the cost of goods and they can ensure that the money stays within the region and that each of the member states have an economic advantage because of these trade agreements. Additionally, MSG members also shared the belief that the region should regulate arms control and disarmament. And so that becomes especially important just because of how heavily militarized Guam is. If you look at a lot of our neighboring countries in the Pacific, a lot of them have actually signed onto nuclear-free provisions into their constitutions because of what happened during World War II, and because we knew what kind of role the Pacific played in all of this nuclear warfare going on throughout the world. They also do this as a way to reduce international tensions. They do this as a way to limit great power rivalries, a way to secure human rights, and to ensure the peaceful resolution of disputes. They don't want to create war within their regions. They want to have this very successful, very peaceful, economically prosperous relationship. And so having agreements like that, where they can't take up arms and they can't sort of have these standing militaries against each other and doing all these things, makes it so that each country feels safe and can trust the other one whenever they have foreign relationships with each other, whenever they have like treaties or whatever it is. They won't fear that someone's going to take over by force. So these principles can be applied to a regional organization that an independent Guåhan could potentially enter into with our neighboring states in Micronesia. This is something that could be done very easily with us here in Micronesia. And this will allow for profitable trading and also a way to limit the threats that Guam's population is currently experiencing because of our role, our international role as it stands. So over to Lola. Next slide, please.
Eva, so we've made it to point number 13. And so just as independence would allow us to rejoin our region, it will also allow us to reclaim our own sense of time and place and ways of learning and being, so that we are centered here first, meeting the needs of our own place before meeting the needs of others very far away. And so we chose to feature 13 points today in honor of the 13 moons that marked one full year for our ancestors. Our Chamorro ancestors marked time using the phases of the moon and the important seasons in their lives. Months were named to describe seasonal weather and the best time to fish, plant, and harvest food. Next slide, please. These are the names of our months, our 13 months that aren't commonly taught. I never learned of our 13 moons and months in school growing up, K through 12 public school Guam education. Nor did I learn about our own seasons for our own fruits and vegetables, for fishing, for farming. But once I learned these 13 months and what they meant, I learned so much more about our land and what grows here and what it provides for us. And so these two slides were actually from a postcard that we designed at the University of Guam Press for a beautiful book called 13 Months in Malesu by Dolores Santos, in which she teaches the 13 months, but also she talks about the ways in which her family in Malesu continues to mark time based on the seasons of their village and their family. And so Dolores will actually be talking about the Chamorro lunar calendar tomorrow on the University of Guam Press's Facebook page at 3 p.m. But I wanted to feature this concept because I really believe that once you learn our language and understand the depth of our language, how a single word can convey so much and mean so many things, you learn your history, you learn your culture in ways that were deliberately kept from you. So for example, Tumaiguini means this is the way. And there's many different reasons for why it could mean that. Tumaiguini is the first month in the Chamorro lunar calendar. This year, it actually falls on February 13th. So another bringing in of that lucky number 13. But, you know, Manny Duenas from the Fishermen's Co-op theorized that it could also mean the fact that that is the time of year when the mahi-mahi come in abundance to the island. This is the way that they come. So, you know, Lumamlam it's the name of a month, and it means, it reminds us that that's the season of lightning. You know, Sumungsung is the time when our ancestors would stay in the village because the waters were too rough. So they would, you know, repair their nets. They would, you know, be with their families. And so we learn so much about ourselves when we reclaim these words. We reclaim and use our language at every chance we can, and we teach it to our children. Next slide. If you're curious about the Chamorro lunar calendar, every year the Western Pacific Regional Fishery Management Council puts out indigenous calendars, and for Guam, the 2021 calendar is already up online. All you have to do is search in Google or whatever search engine for Chamorro lunar calendar, and it will not only tell you when the months start, it will also give you a lot of information about our seasons and our phases of the moon. The reason I felt that it was important for our 13 point to focus on our 13 months is because a huge component of independence will be reframing our education. What are we teaching our kids? What are we learning in our schools? And how do we recenter their learning here so that, you know, as they learn about the Chamorro lunar calendar first, they will begin to understand the ways in which our land can feed and care for and nourish them. And they will also be compelled to care for and nourish our lands. And so there's lots of exciting things on the horizon for our community. And I hope that we can really paddle forward to a more free and independent future. Next slide, please. As we prepare to go into our Q&A, we'd like to just end with an invitation to the community. Every year, in celebration of Tumaiguini and the first new moon of the year, Independent Guåhan takes community members to Fuha in Humatec, which is the site of our creation. It was a known annual pilgrimage that our ancestors made to pay tribute to Punta Nanfa'una. And so we brought this back with Lukau Fua. And these are photos from Lukau Fua last year, but every year we go, we make a place in the middle where we all place our different offerings to our ancestors, and we chant together and we set intentions together, and then on the way back we clean up and we take away all the trash that's there. And so this year, because of COVID, next slide please, we won't be able to have a large community gathering as we have done. So instead we are only bringing smaller groups on 2 days and recording their performances that we hope to share with our community here online. So this year for Lukau Fua, which is called New Moon Rising, and will be an event on our Facebook Live page in March, we are inviting poets, chanters, musicians, and storytellers to please email us at newmoonrising2021@gmail.com by this Sunday, and let us know if you are interested in sharing your words or your music or your artwork at Fua for a smaller lukau. You know, this year is also marking the 500th year since Magellan, you know, stumbled on Guam near death and was fed and brought back to life by our people in 1521. And the world is, you know, there's lots of celebrations, or not necessarily celebrations, but commemorations throughout the world of that event and what it means. And so here on Guam, we wanted to give our own interpretation of our own selves, and in March 2021 really invite people to center on our own story. And so please, if you have poems or chants that you want to share, email again, newmoonrising2021@gmail.com. And so we'll go ahead and stop our share screen and open it up for questions. And I'll turn it over to Fran, who's been keeping track of the questions coming in. So she'll go ahead and pose the first question that came in.
So one of the first questions, and I know this this might be something that many of you are interested in just because of the change with the Davis v. Guam case. So someone had asked, can those of us in the diaspora vote in a plebiscite? So as it stands right now, even with the changes in the Davis v. Guam case, where we no longer go by the definition of native inhabitant, you still have to be a registered voter in Guam in order to do so. So if you do want to vote in the plebiscite, you would have to give up registration where you are and have to do that here in Guam. So it would mean that you may have to move or something like that. We don't allow, or I don't think Guam law will allow those who are not registered voters in Guam to vote in the political status plebiscite.
And that's really to ensure that those who are voting are really invested in the community and aren't just voting to sway the vote in any particular direction, but that are still part of the community. And there are a lot of Chamorros living off island who are still registered voters that would be eligible. But yeah, as of right now, it's still the same. I just want to read a comment that came in. These are things that all colonized people deal with. We need to change our community mindset. Absolutely. The next question was, will things be safer for the island with North Korea now that Trump isn't president anymore? I don't think that that's something I can answer particularly. I think that the relationship between North Korea and the United States is one that has been troubled for a very long time before Trump and through many presidential administrations. I think that my larger answer connecting it to independence is that we need to find ourselves in a position where no matter what the relationship is between the United States and North Korea, we are safe, right? That currently their tensions are what puts our lives at risk. So we need to define ourselves and our identity so that North Korea doesn't think they're just bombing a US base, but rather all places in the world know that we have a unique people, a unique identity, that we are, here and have nothing to do with that conflict, but are at greatest risk of being harmed by it. So, my hope, of course, is that for the whole world, with a new president and a new vice president who are proclaiming, that they want to make the world a better place. They're already taking actions to address climate change and right some of the wrongs of Trump's administration. My hope too is that they take a different approach in terms of defense as well, to make it a safer world. But I hope that answers that question. Fran, you want to take the next one?
So for the next one, it says, what does IG feel about Biden and the new administration? Is this better for us for decolonization or more of the same? So I'm not going to speak on behalf of my fellow IG members, but at least from my point of view, like historically, we've seen that the administration has pretty much treated Guam the same. They still see us as a military site. I mean, even if you're going from Obama to the Trump administration to now Biden, we're seeing that there's still a lot of military posturing that's happening in Guam. Like the military buildup was not something that just all of a sudden came up during the Trump administration. It's something that has been negotiated for quite a long time. In terms of decolonization, we did see an increase in funding from the Obama administration when they gave money for the Commission on Decolonization to have these education campaigns happen about each of the political statuses. So that is a different change. However, that money was still available during the Trump administration. So as far as major changes within decolonization and within administration, we're kind of just going to have to see. But things have pretty much been going on the same direction. So I'm not really anticipating any major changes. But now that we have a new DOI secretary who's native, that could potentially shift things, but I'm not going to say for sure whether or not Biden's going to be a completely different picture from Trump in terms of Guam's decolonization.
All right. Our next question is, how can changing our political status help our effort to preserve the Chamorro language? I think in so many ways. As we mentioned, we would be able to shape our government. We would be able to shape a whole new school system where the Chamorro language can be mandatory. So in the same way that the English language was made mandatory and that shifted how we speak today, it could happen the other way around. When you go to independent nations all over the world, you learn their language. You don't expect them to be forced to speak yours. And so we could have some very drastic changes in that way. And of course, support it with, the resources for immersion learning, which are already taking place today. I believe that it would have to be a community-wide government-led effort. But as we're seeing a lot of the decolonization educational efforts occurring today have led a lot of people back to our language, and I think is really leading to a resurgence and a realization that if we don't use our language and keep it alive, that we will lose so much of who we are. And I think people that support independence have also already taken on the fact that part of decolonization is also decolonizing our tongue. So there's many ways that can occur through our new political systems and educational system that we've developed. Fran, you want to take the next one?
Sure. So another question that came in is, can independence be approached with other islands hand in hand? So we do get this question quite a bit, and they were asking in terms of reunification. And so usually when we're talking about reunification, we mean Guam and the Northern Marianas. So independence can mean that. It can mean that we do maybe reunify with the Northern Marianas. However, that's totally up to the CNMI. Even though we're an independent nation, we can't tell CNMI like, hey, it's time we finally got independence. You guys need to join us so that we can be like the United Marianas Archipelago. So of course, these negotiations will have to happen. In terms of the vote, it will just be Guam itself. So if we do vote for independence, it will mean an independent Guåhan. It won't mean an independent Marianas Archipelago. So when the vote does happen, an independent Guåhan could definitely have this conversation with NMI and see that if it's something they'd be willing to do. However, we're separate political entities at the moment, so we can't actually make it happen unless we actively try to do it with each other.
I'm going to go ahead and actually combine a couple questions that are related. So the question was, how can we help make the case to our non-Chamorro allies about the value of pushing for independence? With another question that says, I agree that Native people of the island should have their vote, but I do not think it is right to ask the taxpayers to cover the cost of something that only benefits the Native people. I am fine with it, but only if I do not have to pay for it. And so I think that that comment is almost at the heart of the response to the question, which is that changing our political status benefits all the people of Guam. Righting the historical wrong of denying a people's sovereignty and the ability to decide their own future benefits all of the people of Guam. And so while someone may feel that they don't want to pay their tax dollars to, to support this, the people of Guam have paid and sacrificed a lot for that person to be here. And we have to remember that first and foremost. But also, what the plebiscite allows is for the Chamorro people to finally choose the type of political future that we want for ourselves. Once we make that choice, we would work with the entire community to design a Guam that gives everybody rights that are denied to everybody who lives here as long as Guam remains an unincorporated territory. And so it's very important that our non-Chamorro allies, one, understand the purpose of this vote, that it really is restorative justice, that a right was denied to a very distinct group of people, and this is an act to restore that right. And then two, that if you love Guam and you love living here, you also have to understand that it is the homeland of the Chamorro people who continue to welcome you here, and that you shouldn't want to continue to harm them and deny them their rights. And so, I think that any one of the political status options available to our community benefits everybody in the community and is much better than being an unincorporated territory. And I think that together we really should recognize that and work together to shape a better Guam, respecting the distinct need for the Chamorro people to finally make this choice.
Thank you, Lola. So another question that came up was, what are the panel's thoughts on art and decolonization? And they said they're working on their thesis, trying to talk about this for Chamorros, and really would love to hear the group's ideas. So for a lot of you who have been following a lot of the events that we have, you'll know that art is really at the heart of some of the things we do. For any of you who have driven through Humatec, you'll see the mural, the Nalatla mural there. That's the IG. I mean, it's this beautiful piece of art down in Humatec. And you'll notice that for us, art is really this great defining space. It helps to create creativity around independence. And art is really this, art has always been used by countries to really get a message across, right? It's such a great way to reach out to people, to connect to them. You'll see, even aside from like print art and things like that, we do it through music. Music for a long time has been used as a way to get messages out there, as a way to get people to see kind of a different point of view, to get them to reimagine a different kind of future. And so for Independent Guåhan, art is just such a great medium to get anybody involved. You see it done through poetry. Poetry is the way that a lot of independent supporters find this outlet for a lot of the anger they may feel, especially when they learn about Guam's history and they learn about the way that people here in Guam were treated, and kind of what's happening as a result of that we cannot decolonize at the moment. And so for them, art has really just been this expression to help them get a lot of that, a lot of those feelings out. And so Independent Guåhan, we strongly encourage art. We very much center many of our events around art, and we would love it if anybody would like to share anything with us. We can always collaborate and things like that. So please reach out to us on any of our platforms if you'd like to do so.
Eva, so we are at our 6:30 hour, and as you can tell by how dark it is getting outside, it's about time for us to wrap up. However, I will attempt looking at the last few questions that came in to close in response to them. And I think at the heart of that, I like this comment. It says, a successful independent Guåhan to me means that when I see empty shelves at Payless, I don't have to worry because we have our land and we can provide for ourselves. A successful independent Guam means strong fiestas again. So I think there is some truth in that, because a lot of the remaining questions centered around how can we even do it? We don't have the infrastructure for it. Only outsiders bring us food. How can we protect ourselves? You know, and these are important questions, and I understand what they're rooted in. However, they're not entirely rooted in truth. I mean, just behind me, I have sweet potato patches. I have lots of papadza. I have lemai that me and my family eat as soon as they're ready for us. I grew up eating avocados and lemai and lemon and doni and things from my yard. It was always a part of my family life. And there are others who have very sustainable farming practices as families and feed us even if we may not be aware of it. So thinking that farming or food is only something that comes in from the outside is very ignorant to the long history of farming and ranching here on the island, and also just really points to the need to get to know our island a little bit better. Also, there are many ways, if we believe that it's impossible for the island to support itself and feed itself here, there are ways that strengthening our relationships with those closer to us will mean that we would be able to feed ourselves more affordably and also more sustainably, not just for ourselves, but for the world. We'd eliminate the carbon footprint of how long food takes to get here and all the resources wasted to do that. And lastly, I think that the best answer I have to a lot of the remaining questions is that we have to remember, and this is something we actually end all of our GAs on, we have to remember what Guåhan means. Guåhan means we have, and at the end of the day, we have to believe in ourselves. We have a lot, and we have to continue this conversation in all our circles with our family, our friends, our leaders. I know there was a comment about how someone had appreciated this conversation but wished it was being had with our leaders. Have those conversations with your leaders. Give them a call. Email them. Some of them love Facebook. Start leaving comments about it. And please encourage these conversations everywhere you go. We hope to see you next month. Our next general meeting is on Thursday, February 25th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. And we'll actually be talking about cannabis as an economic possibility for Guam. So I'll turn it over to Fran for our last goodbye as I fade into the darkness.
So thank you all for joining us, and Happy New Year, everyone. And we hope to see you next month. And Viva Independence and Sizos Masi, everyone. Good night.